It's 11:52 p.m. on a Tuesday, and a 24-year-old named Nobody in Particular is still at her desk because the deal isn't done until the senior banker says it's done. She hasn't eaten since noon. She has rebuilt the same valuation tab 4 times today, each time for a different reason that had nothing to do with the numbers being wrong. Somewhere above her, on a floor she has visited exactly twice, a managing director is approving a wire transfer worth more than her entire family will earn in 3 lifetimes. She will never meet him. She will, however, spend the next 2 decades of her life trying to become him. This is the story of that climb, not the version with the Lamborghini and the champagne, but the real one, the one with the invisible toll booth at every single floor. Because here's the thing nobody tells you when you take the job. The ladder isn't made of money. It's made of trades. At every rung, you hand something over, and you get altitude in return. And by the time you're standing at the top, looking down, you'll barely recognize the person who started the climb. Let's go back to where this machine actually came from, because it didn't always look like this. 200 years ago, banking in most of the world meant a man behind a counter, a ledger, and a vault. The job was custody, keeping your money safe and occasionally lending it out at interest. That changed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when railroads, steel, and oil needed more capital than any single-family fortune could supply. Suddenly, you needed someone who could gather money from thousands of strangers and funnel it into one enormous bet. A transcontinental railroad, a steel monopoly, an oil empire, that someone became the investment banker. And the job has carried the same DNA ever since. Find the capital, structure the deal, take a cut, repeat. What changed over the following century wasn't the core function, it was the scale, the speed, and the sheer abstraction of it. By the 1980s, deals weren't just stocks and bonds anymore. They were leveraged buyouts, junk bonds, and corporate raids that could swallow companies employing hundreds of thousands of people. By the 2000s, it was derivatives so complex that even some of the people selling them couldn't fully explain how they worked. And running quietly underneath every single one of those eras was the same human pyramid. A wide base of exhausted 20-somethings. A narrow peak of people who'd stopped sleeping badly because they'd stopped feeling the weight at all. That pyramid is what we're climbing today. Floor 1, the analyst. You start here with a job title that sounds important and a salary that sounds enormous until you do the math on the hours. 60, 80, sometimes 100 hours in a single week. And you stop mentioning the hours out loud because everyone around you is doing the same thing. And nobody wants to be the one who complains first. Your job, stripped of all its glamour, is to be a human spreadsheet with a pulse. You build models comparing companies that make industrial pumps, or paper packaging, or regional grocery chains, companies you will never visit, run by people who will never know your name. Here's a fact most people don't know. The analyst role as we know it, the 2-year contract with a defined up or out clock, was essentially formalized by Goldman Sachs and a handful of peers in the 1980s as a deliberate filtering mechanism. The firms figured out, decades ago, that the cheapest way to find their future leaders was to flood the bottom with bright, debt-saddled 22-year-olds and see who could survive the pressure without breaking. It wasn't an accident that the hours were brutal. The brutality was the test. Picture a different scene than the trading floor. Picture a kitchen in a Michelin-starred restaurant. The head chef doesn't hand a new line cook the tasting menu on day 1. He hands them onion after onion to dice for months. Because the boring, repetitive, unglamorous work is where you learn whether someone has discipline or just ambition. Wall Street runs the same experiment, just with bigger numbers and worse lighting. Now here's where the first trade happens. The first thing the ladder quietly asks you to give up. One night, deep in a financial model for a mid-sized manufacturing client, you notice something. A formula that's been copy-pasted incorrectly is overstating the company's cash flow by several $million, and that overstated number has already been used in a presentation sent to the client's board 2 days ago. The mistake belongs to a vice president 3 levels above you. You have 2 options, and you know both of them by instinct before you've even finished reading the formula. Option 1, flag it loudly in writing with your name attached, and watch what happens to a VP's credibility in front of a board. Option 2, quietly correct it in the next version. Say nothing. Let the world believe the error simply got cleaned up in the normal course of revisions. You choose option 2, not because you're dishonest, but because you've already learned the unspoken syllabus of this place. Visibility is currency, and spending someone else's visibility without asking is how you make enemies before you've made any allies. This is the first thing the climb takes from you, the assumption that doing the right thing and doing the safe thing are usually the same thing. They're not here. And you'll relearn that lesson in a dozen different costumes over the next 20 years. Let's pause and talk about what's actually happening to a person's brain during this stretch, because it's not nothing. Sleep researchers have a term for chronic, severe sleep restriction. It produces effects on judgment and emotional regulation comparable to mild intoxication. An analyst running on 5 hours of sleep for 18 straight months is not operating with a clear head. They're operating with a head that is quietly adapted to a permanent low-grade fog. And mistaking that fog for just how smart people work is one of the great unexamined lies of this industry. You don't notice it happening to you. Nobody ever does, because the fog rises slowly enough that it just feels like the new normal. 2 years in, if you've survived. And a significant share of analysts at major firms do not make it to the 2-year mark. You get promoted to associate. This is usually the moment people congratulate you. And it's also usually the moment the real psychological shift begins. As an associate, you're no longer just building the model. You're starting to talk to clients. Not lead the conversation, not yet, but you're in the room, and the room changes you. Here's a fresh example. Nothing like a logistics buyout. Let's talk about a regional hospital network. Picture a mid-sized hospital system in the American Midwest, financially strained, looking to merge with a larger health system to survive. You're the associate modeling the synergies, code for where the cost cuts will come from. On your spreadsheet, synergies is a single cell with a percentage in it. In the real hospital, that cell is a nurse's overnight shift. It's a rural clinic's hours. It's a billing department's headcount. Nobody in the deal room calls it that. They call it operational efficiency. The language itself becomes a kind of fog machine. It turns consequences into vocabulary. This is the second trade the ladder asks of you. The trade of language for distance. You learn to describe outcomes in abstract terms. You do it so you never have to picture the person on the other end of the decimal point. It's worth saying plainly here, because the industry rarely says it for you. This isn't unique to finance. Doctors learn clinical detachment to survive operating rooms. Soldiers learn tactical language to survive combat. The difference in finance is that the detachment isn't protecting you from trauma. It's protecting your bonus from your conscience. That's a very different kind of armor to wear for 30 years. By your 3rd or 4th year as an associate, something else starts happening. You start building your own network inside the firm, quietly and almost without deciding to. A senior associate throws you good deal flow because you make her look competent in front of clients. An analyst below you, who you protect from blame because you might need a favor from him in 18 months. This isn't friendship in the traditional sense. It's something closer to a trade alliance. It is the financial firm equivalent of 2 small countries agreeing not to invade each other because they share a more dangerous neighbor. Historically, this kind of internal coalition building has a name in organizational psychology. It's called instrumental reciprocity. Research on high pressure, zero-sum workplaces shows it forms almost everywhere, scarcity and hierarchy combined. This includes trading floors, surgical residencies, and elite law firms. It's not a flaw unique to finance. It's what humans do whenever the ladder is narrow and the climbers are many. 5, 6 years in, you make vice president, and the texture of the job changes again. You're not the one building the model from scratch anymore. You're the one explaining the model's conclusions to people who could fire you with a phone call. Let's use a fresh case here. Imagine a mid-cap renewable energy company trying to raise debt to build a new wind farm. You're the VP in the room when the company's CFO asks a specific question. He asks the question every CFO eventually asks, what happens to our covenant ratios if interest rates rise another 1.5? You don't flinch because you ran that exact scenario 11 times last week. You did it on a Sunday because you suspected he'd ask. This is the unglamorous secret of VP-level competence. It isn't intelligence, it's anticipation. The people who look the smartest in the room are usually just the ones who already had the homework done before anyone assigned it. But here's the third trade. It arrives at this level disguised as professionalism. You stop asking, in your own head, whether a deal is good for the world. You start asking only whether it's good for the deal. Is it financeable? Is it structurable? Is it executable? Those 3 questions quietly replace a 4th question you used to ask without even noticing it. That question was, is it right? Nobody forces this trade on you with a memo or a meeting. It happens the way erosion happens. Too slow to see on any single day, but undeniable after enough of them. Around this stage in a career, something else tends to happen that the industry doesn't advertise. A noticeable share of people quietly leave. They are not fired. They leave on their own. They often cite wanting to spend more time with family in the polite farewell email. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it's the only socially acceptable way to say, I looked at what the next 10 years would cost me, and I said no. The ones who stay aren't necessarily the most talented. They're often simply the ones who made peace with the trade fastest. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it reframes the entire story. The top of this pyramid isn't reserved for the most brilliant people who ever sat at a trading desk. It's reserved disproportionately for the people whose particular psychology allowed them to make these trades without it costing them sleep. That's not a moral failing necessarily. Some people are simply built with a thicker layer of professional armor. The industry selects relentlessly for that thickness at every single promotion. Now you make director, and the job mutates one more time. You stop executing deals and you start sourcing them. Companies call you directly now. Private equity funds route their early conversations through you. They do this because you've built a decade-long reputation for never missing a deadline. You are trusted to never let confidential information leak before it should. That reliability turns out to be worth more than raw cleverness at this altitude. It is boring, unglamorous, and utterly unphotogenic reliability. But at this altitude, everyone in the room is already clever. The only scarce resource left is trust. Let's bring in a different industry for a moment, because this pattern isn't confined to finance. Think about how Hollywood agents operate. A junior agent's job is to read scripts and find talent. A senior agent's job is to be trusted enough that a studio calls them first before the script even exists. The relationship itself has become the product. The asset stops being your skill and starts being your address book. Once that shift happens in any industry, the work changes. It becomes less about being right and more about being known. At the director level in finance, you start to notice something uncomfortable. Information itself has become a form of leverage you didn't ask for. You hear that a major retailer is about to restructure, weeks before the public announcement. You hear that a particular sovereign fund is quietly accumulating a position in a sector. During a hallway conversation in Singapore, you don't trade on any of it. That line is legally uncrossable. For most people at this level, it is also instinctively uncrossable. But the knowing changes you anyway. It makes ordinary conversations feel different. You're constantly holding information you can't share. You are weighing it against information other people are holding that they can't share with you. Psychologists who study secrecy have found something counterintuitive. Carrying information you can't disclose creates a measurable cognitive load. It is a background hum of effort, even when you have zero intention of misusing it. Multiply that hum across a decade and you understand the industry better. You understand why so many senior bankers describe a strange, persistent loneliness. It has nothing to do with how many people surround them at dinner. Then comes the loss that teaches you the lesson numbers never could. You lose a mandate, a genuinely massive one, the kind that would have defined your year. It wasn't because your pitch was weaker. It wasn't because your numbers were wrong. It happened simply because a rival banker sat on the same charity board as the client's chairman. You did everything right, by every metric you'd spent 15 years mastering. And you still lost. Because the deciding factor wasn't on any spreadsheet. It was proximity, plain and simple. The oldest currency in human history, dressed up in a tailored suit. You don't sulk. You don't even really get angry, not anymore. That capacity has been quietly trading itself away for years now, too. But you simply join the board of a museum and then a university endowment committee, because you've learned the final lesson of this rung. Relationships aren't a soft skill in this business. They're the actual infrastructure. And the spreadsheets are just the decoration on top of it. The pressure chamber. Now you make managing director or partner, depending on the firm's particular flavor of vocabulary, and the climb starts to feel less like a ladder and more like a pressure chamber. You're no longer judged on a single deal. You're judged on relationships that span years, sometimes decades. Your clients call you not because they need a banker. They call because they need someone who already understands their company better than most of their own board does. You fly constantly. Zurich on Monday, Dubai on Wednesday. You get back home Thursday night feeling like you've aged a year in 4 days. These trips stop being about any single transaction. They're maintenance, the same way you'd service an engine before it breaks down, except the engine is a decade-long relationship with a sovereign wealth fund or a family conglomerate. An engine that has been your client since you were still an associate. The alignment of time. Here's something worth pausing on because it explains a phenomenon a lot of people misread as simple greed. At this level, your compensation usually isn't a salary anymore. It's carried interest, a slice of the long-term performance of funds and deals you've helped build. It often vests over 5, 7, sometimes 10 years. That single structural detail rewires how your brain plans the future. You stop thinking about this quarter or even this year. You start thinking the way a forest planted by your grandfather's generation thinks. Slowly, patiently, on a timeline, most people can't psychologically hold in their head for long. This is, oddly, one of the more defensible parts of the system. It does genuinely align your incentives with long-term outcomes rather than short-term performance theater. But it comes at a cost that nobody puts in the offer letter. It permanently changes your relationship to time itself, and people around you start to feel slightly out of sync with how you now experience the world. Friends, family, anyone still living in normal quarterly or yearly time. The undersea cable. Let's use one more fresh example here, because the textbook leveraged buyout has been told 1,000 times. Let's talk about an undersea cable instead. Imagine a deal to finance a new fiber optic cable running beneath an ocean, connecting 2 continents, a project that will take 3 years to build. It will quietly carry a meaningful share of the world's internet traffic once it's finished. You assemble a consortium, a pension fund from Canada, a tech company that needs guaranteed bandwidth, and a government development bank that wants the geopolitical leverage of controlling part of the route. None of these three parties trusts the other two on their own. They trust you, the one person who has spent 15 years building exactly this kind of credibility, brick by invisible brick. The deal closes in a conference room in Lisbon, and somewhere off the coast of West Africa, 18 months later, a ship begins laying the very cable your spreadsheet first imagined. The intangible skill and the moral gap. There's something genuinely remarkable buried in that story, and it's worth saying out loud. The industry rarely gets credit for it. Global infrastructure genuinely would not exist at this scale without people who can make total strangers with competing interests trust the same structure. The cables, the power grids, the ports. That's not nothing. That's an actual skill, refined over a brutal multi-decade apprenticeship. And it deserves to be named honestly alongside everything this article has been naming as cost. But the moral terrain at this altitude becomes harder to see clearly, not because you've become a worse person, but because the consequences of your decisions are now so spread out across so many institutions in so many years. Your nervous system simply can't locate them anymore. When a deal you structured eventually requires cost cutting at some operating company 3 years later, you don't feel it the way you'd feel stepping on a nail. You feel it the way you'd feel a headline about a country you've never visited. It's real, it's true, and it has almost no texture to it at all. That gap is the single strangest and most underdiscussed cost of climbing this particular ladder. The gap between the size of your impact and the size of what you actually feel. The elder statesman. Now picture the very top, the rarest rung. The one almost nobody reaches and almost nobody outside the industry ever hears about. The elder statesman. No active title most people would recognize. Maybe senior advisor. Maybe a name on a family office that quietly holds positions in a handful of funds, a couple of private banks, an insurance vehicle registered somewhere with favorable tax treatment. You're in your 70s now. You've spent close to half a century inside this machine. Long enough that you remember when deals were settled with a handshake and a paper confirmation faxed the next morning. Long enough to have watched 3 or 4 entire technological eras of finance come and go underneath you. Central bank officials know your first name, not because you set monetary policy, but because information has quietly learned to flow in both directions between you and them, the way water finds its way between 2 basins that sit at nearly the same height. You don't really trade anymore, not in the active sense. You position. You see early signs of stress in a currency block or credit market 2 years before the headlines catch up. Not because you have a crystal ball, but because you've spent 50 years building the kind of pattern recognition that comes from watching the same human behaviors repeat across a dozen different decades in disguises. When the stress eventually arrives, and your positioning turns out to have been correct, the financial press will likely call it prescient. It isn't really prescience. It's just 5 decades of compound pattern recognition, finally cashing out. The final trade. And here, at the very summit, the final and strangest trade reveals itself. The one nobody warns you about at any point during the climb. You have more access to information, more influence over outcomes, more genuine understanding of how the world's capital actually moves than almost anyone alive. And you have fewer than 10 people in your life you can be completely honest with. That is the account for most people who've actually reached this altitude. The climb started with a kitchen table conversation about which business school to attend. It ends in a room with no presentation on the screen, where you speak for 6 quiet minutes and a multi-billion-dollar decision simply happens. It happens because the room has learned over decades to trust exactly what you say. And somewhere far beneath that room, on a floor with worse lighting and no view, a 24-year-old is rebuilding a valuation tab for the 4th time tonight, certain that this is a story about money. It was never really about money. It was about what each floor of the climb quietly asks you to set down before it lets you take the next step up. And whether, decades later, you can even remember everything you left behind on the way. That's the machine. It isn't cruel exactly, and it isn't kind either. It simply runs on the oldest fuel there is. Ambitious people willing to trade a little of themselves at a time for just one more floor. The terminal blinks, the market opens, and somewhere, right now, someone is making that first trade without even realizing they've made it.